So my research question is, does a primarily poor diet lead to increased stress and illness in young adults? The inclusion criteria states that the term poor diet refers to an array of things, including processed foods, canned foods, foods high in sodium, foods high in added sugars, and other unhealthy additives. Stress and illness refers to any negative effect on one's body, be it physically or mentally, including but not limited to things such as high blood pressure and cholesterol, skin breakouts, weight gain, diabetes, mental illness, and anything else. So here we have my 12 references. The ones in black are the 10 that I included that explicitly defined or support my research question in some way. And the two here in red, this one as well as this one, kind of went in the completely opposite direction of where I wanted to go, so that's why I chose to exclude them. My first article is Chronic Inflammatory Diseases Are Stimulated by Current Lifestyle, How Diet, Stress Levels, and Medication Prevent Our Body from Recovering. This was actually the initial article that I chose when coming up with my research question, because it specifically goes into detail about how the foods you eat affect what happens to your body. The authors coined a term called resoluomics, which is defined as the process of inflammation resolution. And it basically says that what happens with inflammation is a controlled process of the immune system and not just a consequence of extinguished or exhausted immune reactions. They wrote that resoluomics is considered the evolutionary mechanism of restoring homeostatic balances after injury, inflammation, and infection. So I chose this article because it, as I said, goes into great detail about what affects your body and how your body reacts to stress. So let's see. They use multiple diagrams to kind of show what happens during inflammation and how different chemicals relate to what goes on. So here we have the phases of inflammation and stress. It talks about the 3 different phases: initiation, resolution, termination. Here we have another diagram about nutritional factors. So the article says right here, this section that I am highlighting, that increased omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids have been demonstrated in recent studies and have shown that they help regulate the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines and decrease linoleic acid levels in phospholipids. So basically what this is saying is that these omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids basically increase the production of cytokines that lead to inflammation. So right here is a prime example of how, what you eat, how it negatively affects your body. It also talks about the glycemic index and how foods that are higher up on the index are likely to increase inflammation. Also, it states that high glycemic food intake causes hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia, which would affect, your body's way of processing insulin, and which obviously could lead to things like diabetes and other sugar-related illnesses. It goes on to talk about medications and how medications also affect resilience, but I chose to specifically focus on the nutrition part. Let's see. More data and more. And then here it just defines the abbreviations of the terms that were used in the article, because as you can see, a lot of these are very big terms, and most of them are very hard to pronounce. So this was the first article, and the one that I feel best defines my research question. The next article is canned vegetable and fruit consumption is associated with changes in nutrient intake and higher diet quality in children and adults. Now this one is related to my research question, but not directly, because as the abstract states, it says that the association of canned fruits and canned vegetables kind of improves, your nutrient intake and your diet quality. So the results stated that compared to those who did not consume canned vegetables and canned fruits, those who did were taking in more energy and were therefore getting more dietary fiber, more total sugar, choline, potassium, and coincidentally less fat and less saturated fat. They were getting more protein, more vitamin A, calcium, and magnesium. Let's see, methods, index. So, as I said earlier, this one doesn't necessarily, it supports my research question, but kind of in a different sense, because my research question included, canned foods as a quote-unquote poor diet, but this kind of shows that, not all canned foods are necessarily bad. Some of them, as in canned fruits and vegetables, can actually help increase your diet and increase your health. My third article was the consumption of canned food and beverages and urinary bisphenol A concentrations. So, I'm sure at this point everyone has heard of BPA. A lot of plastics contain it, and it's very, very unhealthy. So this article basically talks about how when BPA is introduced to your body, it affects, or how when you eat canned foods and packaged processed foods, how the level of BPA, which is a toxin, is increased. So in the conclusion of this article, it states that canned foods were associated with higher levels of urinary BPA. And so this was just an example of, how processed foods negatively affect your health, because obviously BPA is a toxin, and the higher the concentration of BPA in your body, the less healthy you are. And there have been people who have gotten sick from having too much, from BPA poisoning and stuff like that. My fourth article is the potential effect of salt reduction in processed foods on health. And this basically talks about how it states that excessive salt intake has been associated with hypertension, which is high blood pressure, and increased cardiovascular disease, morbidity, and mortality. So things such as, heart attacks, stroke, myocardial infarction, stuff like that. And the objective of this study was to evaluate health benefits of salt reduction strategies. So they had 3 different scenarios, and the outcome was that the outcome is stated right here: 4.8% of acute myocardial infarction cases, 1.7% of congestive heart failure, and 5.8% of stroke can be prevented if salt intake meets the recommended maximum intake. The burden of disease is decreased and life expectancy is increased. So basically, this article is stating that the more salt you have in your diet, obviously, the more likely you are to suffer from heart problems, heart disease, high blood pressure, stuff like that. Again, this article goes into really great detail of how salt affects your body. I thought this one really supported my research question because it showed a direct effect between a nutrient, or, well, in this case, salt, and the damaging effects on the body. My next article is Trends in Consumption of Ultra-Processed Foods and Obesity in Sweden. Basically, the purpose of this article or study was to investigate how consumption of ultra-processed foods has changed in Sweden in relation to obesity. So they took there's different data tables, and let's see, they have different data tables, and they talked about like household spending on food and how whether or not you bought more fruits and vegetables had played a role in a household's obesity. Because obviously we know that obesity leads to, different diseases, asthma, diabetes, heart problems, stuff like that. There were limitations on this article because the terms weren't as clearly, like the study wasn't as clearly defined as others may have been. This specifically talked about household food spending, but didn't take into account for the food that is wasted, the food that's not consumed, and it didn't study individuals within the household, it just studied the entire household itself. But I thought that this was a good article because it showed the correlation between healthier diet and lower obesity. This next article is titled Increasing Consumption of Ultra-Processed Foods and Likely Impact on Human Health, Evidence from Brazil. And it's actually similar to the article on Sweden, except it specifically focused on Brazilian households. Let's see. And so again, this article talks about foods that were purchased, processed foods versus unprocessed, healthy, fruits and vegetables and stuff. Again, this states limitations as household food availability and not specifically diet. And it also states here 2 limitations are that wasted food and food eaten outside of the home were not taken into account. So as with the Sweden article, the data is not fully accurate in this sense. However, I do feel that it does support my research question. Here it says that ready to eat, ready to heat, ultra processed foods are displacing or taking over unprocessed and minimally processed foods. And an increased purchase of soft drinks, confectionery, as in sugar and biscuits or cookies, has shown that let's see. No. It has shown to lower, health. Right. And it also, this one was actually really interesting because it also stated that ultra-processed foods have not only physical negative physical effects, but also social, cultural, and environmental impacts. So I thought that was really interesting. It does kind of go a little bit off track from what my research question is, but I thought that was something really interesting that I can work into my research. This next article, Consumption of Ultra-Processed Foods and Likely Impact on Human Health Evidence from Canada, is really similar, if not almost the same, as the article before it, except it focuses on Canadian households instead of Brazilian households or Swedish households. But it has the same, the same goals to investigate consumption of ultra-processed products in Canada and to assess their association with dietary quality. It says that an important cause of the pandemic of overweight and obesity and the rapid rise of chronic diseases is related to the production and consumption of readily available fast foods, convenience foods, ready-to-eat foods, ready-to-heat, processed foods, etc., etc. So again, the methods data were fairly similar, but I felt that this article gives me more data on, how these foods affect your body. Let's see. And again, it has the same limitations of food purchasing, food that's wasted was not taken into account. This one states, unit of analysis was households and not specific individuals. So this article, as well as the article before it, talked about how all these processed foods, don't meet the World Health Organization recommendations that are put in place to help prevent and control diseases and obesity. It also states that if we have a more healthy diet, it would contain less than 1/3 of the energy in the form of ultra-processed products. Basically stating that ultra-processed products give you less energy. The next article was not a study per se, but more of kind of like a briefing of research, and it's Poor Diet and Shift Workers, a New Occupational Health Hazard. Basically, this article from PLOS. Don't recall off the top of my head what that stands for. Just kind of writes about how shift workers, like 24-hour work shifts, are becoming more and more common, but how a lack of a healthy diet can affect, and lack of sleep can affect their performance. It states that the association between shift work and diabetes has been suggested before, but this study with 18 to 20 years of follow-up is the best evidence so far, with an increasing risk of type 2 diabetes in the first and second cohorts of the NHS as duration of shift work increased. So the longer people work, the less they have, less abilities to, maintain a healthy diet, maintain an appropriate level of sleep, and this leads to obesity and type 2 diabetes. And the article also states that if jobs focused on enforcing better diets, we could eliminate many of the health problems that occupational workers have. So I thought this was a cool little real life example of how poor diet can cause illness and injury to people. The next article is food packaging and bisphenol A and bis 2 ethahexyl phthalate exposure. So this relates back to the previous article about BPA and says how these two chemicals, BPA and for short DEHP, are high production volume chemicals used in plastics, as I stated earlier, in food packaging. These have been associated with the disruption of the endocrine system in animals and some human studies. The studies on humans have not gone into great detail, obviously. You can't, there's that whole issue of ethics and testing on human subjects, so a majority of these studies were done on animals. So what this study did was measured BPA and phthalate metabolites before, during, and after a fresh food intervention. So these people maintained these 20 participants maintained a normal diet. Their BPA levels were measured and were shown to be extremely high. And then after a 3-day fresh food cleanse, foods that were not canned, foods not packaged in plastic, stuff like that, showed that their BPA levels were lower. Materials and methods, results. This article, as well as the other BPA article, don't specifically state what BPA does to the body. So when it comes time to write my paper, that's definitely something that I plan on including. I had a 10th article, but for whatever reason I can't find it anymore, so my 10th article is going to talk about how BPA affects your body. So yeah, those are my 9 or 10 articles on how diet affects your body. Right here I have the 2 articles that I chose to exclude, and this one is anti-carcinogenic, cardioprotective, and other health benefits of tomato compounds lycopene, A-tomatine, and tomatidine in pure form and in fresh and processed tomatoes. I chose to exclude this simply for the fact that I was looking for data that stated how processed and canned foods negatively affected your body, whereas this kind of shows how they positively affect your body. So it is something that I can include as like a counter argument. And my second article that I excluded, European consumer attitudes on the associated health benefits of nutraceutical containing processed meats using coenzyme Q10 as a sample functional ingredient. Again, as the article before this, I chose to exclude it because more so because it seems to be an opinion-based article. They interviewed different people to discover like what their attitudes were towards processed canned foods. So it doesn't necessarily support my research question, but it also doesn't go against my research question. So it's more of like, I guess it's more filler information, like what does the public think of these types of foods in their diet. So those were my 12 articles, and yeah.